Content warning. Castration, Nazism and the Holocaust, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Action, excitement, horror, romance, thrills and chills, swords and sorcery, rockets and ray guns, a dizzying panoply of the strange and impossible from the darkest depths of the human imagination. What mad universe encompasses such tales as these? Join us as we bear witness to the sweeping sprawl of all the history that never was and all the futures that could yet be. It's adventure as you like it on What Mad Universe?
Could another group, to avoid the obvious, let's call them Force X, have stage managed the whole thing? So you've got MVD, CIA, and FBI, and who are all falling over each other sniffing around Dallas and New Orleans for clues, and Force X gets to seem more and more implausible to all of them, because it is intrinsically incredible. It is incredible because it has no skeleton, no shape, no flesh, nothing they can grab hold of. The reason is, of course, that Force X is the Illuminati, working through 5 leaders with 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1, or 120 different basic vectors. A conspiracy with 120 vectors doesn't look like a conspiracy, it looks like chaos. The human mind can't grasp it, and hence declares it non-existent. The Eye of the Pyramid, the Illuminatus Trilogy, by Robert Anton Wilson and Robert Shea. Hi, welcome to What Mad Universe, the podcast where we take a look at pulp from the popular to the obscure. I'm Philip, and with me as always is Adam.
Hello, how are we? We're good.
Okay. Today we're going to look over the Illuminatus Trilogy by Robert Shea and Robert Anton Wilson. Is it Anton or Anton?
Anton, yeah. I've always heard it Robert Anton Wilson, or Raw, as he calls himself.
Yeah. First published in 1975, though written earlier. This is a weird series of books, and there's a lot to talk about. I've often described the trilogy as simultaneously brilliant and garbage. Not that parts are brilliant and parts are garbage, but that all of it is both at once. It's a raucous voyage through the 60s and early 70s counterculture, and conspiracy theories, magic, literary references from Joyce to Lovecraft, all mashed together in a giant soup.
Mm-hmm.
It's a series where talking dolphins help a yellow submarine fight Illuminati spider ships in the ruins of Atlantis, but also where a guy fucks a giant golden apple. There's drugs and murder and sex, lots of sex. Detailed descriptions of sex acts written in a way that sometimes made my stomach churn. It's massively self-indulgent, but in my opinion it works wonderfully. So, what are your experiences with this book? Because both of us have read it before.
I mean, my experience was that it was recommended, and I tried to read it. Actually, I do have a mild story, which is that there was a webcomics guy named Patrick Farley, I believe his name was, who did some interesting webcomics, and he was a big fan of Robert Anton Wilson. In fact, I believe he did the web design on Wilson's website. So I started reading his blogs before. This was just before he passed on, Robert Anton Wilson, so I got exposed to it through that, and then I finally decided to break down and read the trilogy. So that's what happened.
I'd been hearing about it because I've always had an interest in conspiracy theories, not as a believer, but it just like the psychology behind them.
Right.
Like when I was a teenager, I had a conspiracy theory that I made up that sea urchins were psychic and controlling the world. I could link everything to the Sea Urchin Collective, basically, and like randomly just come up with things on the fly, and people thought I was serious, and I just found it amusing. And later I learned that the reptilian thing is basically exactly that, but with reptilians. So
right, and we have discussed that in the Cull show briefly. So yeah, well, no, it's going to be relevant. When I grew up, I was in the '90s. We'll talk about a bit. I think we'll talk about a bit this later. But just the X Files. I was a huge fan of the X Files, of course, which is kind
Okay,
of the
yeah, I've never actually seen a full episode, so
Yeah, yeah, that was a little after your time or before your time, right?
no,
So
it was on TV. It was in reruns at least while I was growing up. So
right, and it's actually interesting. Again, we'll talk about this in a bit, but it is interesting the degree to which this. I'm not sure the X Files was as much influenced by this, except it was because this is kind of the great granddaddy of all the conspiracy fiction. But it's in quite a different direction essentially.
yeah,
But
this doesn't. This has sort of some alien stuff, but not much.
right, yeah, that's the and there's sort of a different filter for it, I think. But we'll talk about that in a moment. But let's just to mention the book itself. It came about because Wilson and Shea, and interestingly, I've been able to find very little about Robert Shea, the other author. Wilson is usually the guy who gets all the credit for this book. But they were working as the editors for the letters section of Playboy magazine, and as is my understanding, and basically in the '60s, and they got lots and lots of crackpot letters from people with conspiracy theories. So they
Yeah,
basically
another podcast I listened to was reviewing this book, and they hated it, but whatever. But they joke that when I have like a theory of how the world works, I send it to the pornography group that I read. I send it to Brazzers or
Yeah, but Playboy was actually taken somewhat seriously at the time. Like that was actually one of the things that brought kind of sex into the mainstream as a literary. Of course, it was there were still some really stuffy people, but the Playboy was seen as like it was a hip intellectual publication basically. So
I
it
know
was.
I found that funny.
It is. Well, yeah, in retrospect, it does seem weird. But at the time, it wouldn't have been that far out from somebody sending letters to Time or Life magazine. It was a
Yeah,
major publication in the '60s. But also, I mean, the people who are sending in conspiracy theories, they're not
yeah.
considering this very carefully, right? They've got a bit of their own ideas going on. Anyway,
Mm-hmm.
so Wilson decided he was going to write a novel, and Shea, they decided they were going to write a novel in which all of the various theories they read in these letters were true and unified into a gigantic grand conspiracy. And
Even the ones that contradict the other ones.
that's right, yes. And the great thing about conspiracy theories is you can do that, obviously. When we talk about this, now, when we're going to talk about the mythos that gets built up in this book, we're going to sort of present it as it's initially presented. Part of the point of the book is that as you peel back the layers, things get then you learn that what you thought was true is actually a lie, and there's another level to it.
And then there's another level and another level, and what
Right.
we're given at the end is like we assume that's what it is because that's how it ends. But if it went on a little longer, it would probably change again.
Maybe, yes. So, where to begin? The Illuminatus is, as you've probably heard, the group that secretly controls the entire world as a group of super puppet masters led by the Illuminati Privy. This book ties them into the ancient rule, or not the ancient rulers, but an ancient faction from Atlantis. And Atlantis is real.
Started by Gruad.
Gruad, yeah.
The
It
Gruad
was
Greyface, who was a mutant Atlantean. All the other Atlanteans were hairy,
right.
like completely covered in hair. But this was a mutant who had just a close cropped head of hair and a beard. So
Yeah, he looked like a modern human, in
yeah.
other words, as opposed to the other Atlanteans who were.
And this is ancient Atlantis. So the Atlantis that we know is actually modern Atlantis. That's a remnant of ancient Atlantis. So this is like 50,000 years. Yeah. Yeah, so the ancient Atlantis was scientifically advanced, like they're futuristic, but they were also they didn't have a system of morality the same way we do. Like it's like prior
Right.
to original sin. So that's the idea, I guess.
Right, they didn't
And
have government. They didn't have morality. They were basically total anarchists, which is the theme of the book. And they had higher technology than anything we'd ever even now that we have on Earth.
Yeah.
Um,
Um,
and the Gruad, who was a mutation, and they talk in the book about neophobes and neophiles as there are people who are afraid of the new and people who create the new, and the neophiles. And Groad is actually described as being the first neophile, even though he's the one who was the big enemy who destroyed Atlantis. Because he developed a system of morality, a religion, and he started saying, no, people need to do things this way and not the other way. And he was opposed by, a freedom party who, interestingly, you would associate them with, the heroes who are anarchists. But there are other things that are confusing about it, and there was also a nothing-arian party, right?
mhm.
The led by, do you want to say it, Lilith Velkor,
Yeah.
who was the whole thing has a lot of clearly deliberate echoes of Adam and Eve and the garden and
Yeah.
all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
So Lilith Valkor is obviously based on Lilith, who's um, uh, not actually a biblical character, but sort of introduced to explain some, um, contradictions in the two Genesis stories of creation, because it sort of contradicts itself. So,
right,
and she's crucified on an upside down cross that resembles the peace symbol. So that's where the peace symbol came from in this universe.
right. And she's then able to possess actually a male Atlantean but he's named Evo, and then he later castrates himself, and there's a whole thing going on where he's the biblical Eve apparently, but it in a way that doesn't make a lot of sense. I think
There's also somewhat of an implication that he might have been faking it, like he committed a crime, so he pretended that he was possessed by Lilith Falcor.
I see. Okay. Yeah,
I mean, it's sort of ambiguous, I think, but
yeah,
I got that impression.
He's yeah, I got my take on that is that he was that Wilson and Shea were trying to sort of take the misogyny out of that storyline basically by making it a guy instead, and it was overreaction to female sexuality basically. Because Gruad is very evil, and the way it plays out, basically they flee to Agarthy, which is another common sort of conspiracy slash old like Theosophists believed in Agarthy, which is a
Yeah. I think it's connected to some sort of thing in like Buddhist belief, but it's been warped by
right.
Westerners.
Yeah, the
in
West
terms of what it means.
Right, like Theosophy, like 19th century, mystics kind of appropriated it as from the late 19th to the early 20th centuries. There was a lot of appropriation of Asian ideas and symbols, up to and including the swastika, actually, and turning it to mean
up to
whatever.
modern day, really, but
well, yeah, of course, but I mean, it was really bad during that period, I would say.
Yeah.
And they turned it into their own kind of mythos, and Agarthy is part of that. It's also associated with the Hollow Earth theory, which of course makes an appearance in this book. Although here it's specifically an underground network of oceans, which is
there's the Sea of Volusia, which is beneath Europe,
right.
And Volusia is of course the kingdom from the Kull stories.
Right. Yes.
So and we'll get to that. There's a lot of working in between real life conspiracy theories and complete fiction, and sort of blending them all together into one thing.
As I say, they're trying to basically blend in everyone's conspiracy theories, and the conspiracy theories were probably coming from things people had read, both in the news and in urban legends, and also in pulp. As you mentioned, when we did our Kull show, our second show, Robert E. Howard wrote about a race of snake people who had infiltrated the government of Volusia in the Kull stories, and they were secretly, managing affairs, and Kull had to stand up to them. And that seems to have highly inspired the modern day conspiracy theory about reptile people, as you mentioned.
And they sort of make an appearance in this. They're the Ophidians, which is a genetically engineered group created by Gruad as enforcers, but they're not a big part of the story, and that's probably because the reptilian thing didn't really take off till David Icke in the 90s, as a
Right.
mainstream conspiracy theory.
Yeah. Well, this is one of those things where you can see them trying to knit absolutely everything together. So they mention the Ophidians, but they're not, as you say, a huge part of the story. In though, if this had been written a decade or two later, they might have made the Snake People a much bigger part of the story.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
because that
Alien
became
stuff isn't really treated with much. I mean, they hint at it
right.
sometimes, but it's not really a
Yeah.
thing in this book.
Yeah, which is funny because that was a big thing, especially in the 50s. There is a flying saucer eventually in this story, but he actually dismisses Hagbard Celine, who's a major character. Uh,
Isn't it
uh,
Chelene? It's
sorry?
Hagbard Chelene
Oh, okay.
with a
Shalene?
Chelene, like a
Oh,
chilling.
I did not know that. Okay.
Well, that
Hagbard.
I initially read this via audiobook years ago,
Oh, okay.
and that's how they pronounced it. So
Oh,
I
okay.
assume
Well, I think it's an Italian. It's supposed to be an Italian name.
it
So
is. Yeah.
yeah, Shalene. Okay, interesting.
So Hagbard Chelene is sort of the protagonist of this story.
Sort of.
Like he's not the
You know
main
what? I'd say
character, but he's the driving force of the
yeah.
action.
Right, he's kind of the Jack Sparrow in that he's not the nominal protagonist. I would say the nominal protagonist is George Dorn,
Yeah.
and it is interesting because they set it up as Saul Goodman, who's going to be the main character when it
Yeah,
starts.
he's
And yes,
a New York detective.
right, yeah, and yes, his name is Saul Goodman. To the point where I actually wonder if the Better Call Saul actually took that from this book.
Oh, I didn't even think of that. Jeez.
Because it's well, in both cases, it was because it's a pun on Saul Goodman. You know, that's
Okay.
the joke. But and they explicitly reference it in the show. I think that most of the characters in this book have names that are silly or references to things. So I
Yeah.
think that's the origin of that one there. But he's set up as this detective. The book literally starts describing the plot is not incredibly relevant to this book,
And
but
it would be very hard to do, so we'll just pick out bits and pieces of
yeah. But
the
it does.
metaplot. But
Yeah, it does start with a bombing in New York of a magazine called Confrontation, which is trying to peel back the truth, and a detective.
but it's a left-wing magazine specifically.
Right. It's uncovering, maybe getting too close to the truth, and Saul Goodman comes in to who's a New York cop. He comes in to investigate, and almost immediately we kind of leave him, and we only cut back to him briefly throughout the story.
Yeah, we get a lot of excerpts from the stuff he's reading on the case.
Right.
From the explanations of the Illuminati that contradict each other and that sort of thing.
Right. Yeah. He's reading the notes that the editor Joe Malick left behind, who was the editor of the magazine. And Joe Malick ends up. We learn later that he had actually gotten inducted into everything. But the main character is really George Dorn, I would say.
Yeah.
In the sense that he's the guy who kind of is the audience surrogate, and we explore everything through him. Whereas Hagbard Celine is kind of
he's sort of a left-wing reporter for Confrontation, and he gets caught up in this when he goes down to Mad Dog, Texas, to investigate local Illuminati activity, and he ends up in prison because he's a long-haired hippie freak.
Right.
And Hagbard and Mavis, who's another character, break him out of the prison. So that's how he gets caught up in all this.
Right, and he takes some Hagbard Celine, Chelene, excuse me. He takes him on board his giant golden submarine. So yes, it is a yellow submarine.
And they mention that.
And they go to they start by going to the ruins of Atlantis. And one of the things I kind of liked as a literary device was just that this was actually a metaphor for going underwater and exploring the Hollow Earth and the ruins of Atlantis and all that became a metaphor for investigating and exploring all these different conspiracies. They're literally going to the underworld and exploring the secret meaning of everything by going to Atlantis and going to Agartha and all these different places.
They have there's talking dolphins or porpoises. They switch between the two names.
Right.
Even though they're different species, but anyway, they can't actually talk. But apparently, in this universe, dolphins are intelligent, and Hagbard's submarine has translators, so he can understand what they're saying through the ship.
Yeah, Hagbard has a supercomputer called Up, Um, we're gonna have to bleep the name. FUCKUP.
But it stands for First Universal Cybernetic Kinetic Ultra Micro Programmer.
Right, which of course he just chose because he liked the name.
Yeah.
And and it can do all kinds of amazing things, including basically predicting the general shape of the future and communicating with the dolphins. And the dolphins
And
are,
as it turns out, is the narrator of the book.
right. Well, sort of. He's the narrator of the book is literally a free flowing consciousness that keeps.
It's sort of glossed over, but yeah, there's a line where he says, "I now realize who I am," the
Mm,
omniscient narrator, because he
right.
has a sort of crisis of identity at the beginning of the narration in the book,
Right. Yeah.
and then he
He sort of
discovers
says
who
he
he
doesn't.
is at the end.
Right. And that's an interesting thing about the book because it goes between describing the characters in the third person and describing them in the first person. So sometimes he'll be, talking about what Saul Goodman's doing, and then suddenly he'll be uh, narrating as though he was Saul Goodman, and then he'll switch
Yeah,
over to being
and
George Dorn or whoever.
there's other parts where it uh, at one point it's Hagbard used to be a lawyer for Native American rights,
Hmm.
and it shows a just deposition with like judge and then Hagbard and then so
Right.
it's got all sorts of literary different ways of writing, and it's all
Right.
sort of
It's
it
very
switches somewhat at random
right.
seemingly.
Yeah. It's done as if it was kind of a Jackdaw novel. Like it's made up of, I guess, trying to emulate the whole thing that Saul Goodman receives from the confrontation bombing, where he's going through all these different files and different transcripts and things. So it's capturing a bit of that feeling, and he also links it specifically to the idea of all humans are one shared consciousness, and we've only
Not
forgotten
just
that we're
humans.
yeah. Well, yeah, I guess everything in the world.
At one
I guess
point, he's a squirrel, the narrator. So
right, that's right, and the dolphins, of course.
yeah,
And as we say, the cybernetic organisms. So, and that, of course, is tied into the idea of Leviathan, which is the name of the third book, and the idea of a multi-headed singular consciousness. But he's the whole book is anarchist in spirit, so it's trying to remind us that we're all one consciousness, basically.
mm-hmm.
uh, um, but just getting back to the whole mythos, so the Illuminati are literally the descendants of Gruad's people who destroyed Atlantis with a solar flare, continued to sort of mow down the Atlantean culture for thousands of years.
And
Because
kept civilization from popping up again because it thought it wasn't ready yet.
Right.
It was too influenced by old Atlantis, so it actually kept civilization down for like 20,000 years, and then
right.
finally let it build up again under their influence.
Yeah, and he literally describes it as, they had guns and they had, basically modern technology, but they were forcing Cro-Magnons to come down out of the hills and learn farming and so on,
Mm-hmm.
and waiting until it was actually set up the way they wanted it to, and then they kind of retreated back to Agarthy. And they've been manipulating everything ever since.
It should be noted, Agarthy here, it's usually described as a mountain. Here it is a mountain, but it's under the ocean that's below Europe. So it's
right. Yeah, it's Agarthy, I believe, is usually linked to Hollow Earth theory and the idea of an underground cavern.
But its entrance is usually a mountain, but in this case it is as well.
Right.
But it's an underwater mountain.
Right, it's in the Himalayas, and as a few people pointed out, it's often sort of mixed up with Shambhala, which is the mythical...
and Shangri-La, which is a fictional version.
Right. The thing that's supposed to exist in the Himalayas, the great city of wisdom and all that stuff. So they all kind of get lumped together. I'm not 100% sure Agarthy is originally from Eastern tradition. I think that might be
I might be wrong. I don't know much about that subject specifically, but I just know about it through conspiracy literature. So and they.
From what I was doing when I researched it, it actually sounds like it is a European invention because it's 19th century writers who started talking about it. It might have been a corruption. They called it Agartha as well. It might have been a corruption of an Eastern idea, but I think it was very heavily filtered through Western ideas.
That makes sense.
So it probably wasn't even, quote, Agarthy or Agartha. It was probably something else, and they mangled it. But anyway, so and then we've got all these different groups over the years, including the assassins or Hashashim of the 11th century, who were an Islamic group, and this is all real. By the way, as we talk about all this, we're kind of mixing actual history in with the history as it's described in the book. So don't treat any of this as actual history when we talk about it, just so
Yeah.
we're not confusing about this. But a lot of it is based on real history.
And some of it's based on, yeah, like I said, it's conspiracy theories that actually existed at the time about history. So it's all mixed up
Right.
together.
Yeah, so I almost feel like this is what popularized and kind of unified a lot of conspiracy theories that otherwise might have been very underground up till that point. Like I think that a lot of Hollow Earth theory being a big thing. Well, except that the Nazis believed in Hollow Earth theory as
Yeah,
well.
Hollow Earth goes back a while.
Yeah.
It was big in the 19th century, as we discussed in the
Yeah.
Great Coming Race episode.
Right, exactly. Yeah, that's a bad example. I do feel like some of these might not have been widely popularized until this book came out.
Definitely the number 23 thing was popularized by this.
Right, right.
The idea that everything's connected through number 20, like everything can be.
Well, the number
Like,
5, but 23 is a common iteration of it because 2 plus 3 equals 5.
yeah. But
Right.
23 specifically, I think, not comes from this book, but was popularized by it.
Right.
Which is funny because the book actually says the
Yeah.
real rule of the number 23 thing is that if you work hard enough, you can make anything fit.
Right, right. Which is, of course, the metaphor for the entire book, how it's
Yeah.
and conspiracy theories in general. That it's you can connect everything if you work hard enough and come up with elaborate enough explanations.
Yeah.
Just quickly, so yeah, but just quickly, the various groups. So they mentioned the Hashashim or Assassins group, who of course gave us are the modern name Assassins, and they were
the word hashish.
well, you know what? It sounds like that is actually probably a misunderstanding.
Oh, okay.
That the names are similar, and people assumed that they were inspired by hash, but in fact, that's a different thing. It's just the words are similar because they were given hash. That was the thing. When people were inducted into this group, this order of elite killers, they were drugged with hash, among other things. They passed out, and then they woke up in their underground sanctum, which was a beautiful garden. There was a feast. Beautiful women were serving you food. Of course, that is basically how it's described in the Quran, the afterworld. But they really gave it a firm depiction of that became popularized. And they said, well, this is the afterlife, and you're getting a vision of the afterlife if you do your holy duty and go on this mission that we're sending you on, basically. So they'd pass out again. They'd be woken up, and they'd be dreaming of this holy this place that they'd be going to in the afterlife. And that was
the leader of this group was called Hassan Isabah. Is that how you pronounce it?
Yes, that's right. Hassan Isabah. He was the leader, and like I say, it was a military order. It was part of the quote Ismailite sect of Islam in the medieval era. And I mean, they weren't, of course, the first. There were lots of other groups, like the Eleusinians in Greece, and even the Gnostic Christians, who don't play as huge a role in this book as I would have expected them to.
No.
But
there's the Knights Templar.
Right, the Knights Templar, who may
are
be the actual historical descendants of of these kind of Gnostic groups. But these are all groups that had initiation rites, right?
Yeah, and of course the Bavarian Illuminati.
Right. Well, the Bavarian Illuminati are where it really gets going, because they're the modern.
They're real. They existed. They were formed in 1776 by Adam Weishaupt, in Bavaria, obviously. He was, according to this novel, a defrocked Jesuit, though it seems that that's not actually the case. He was a non-clerical teacher at a Jesuit school, who became frustrated by the way his ideas were being marginalized by the religious staff. And he rejected joining the Freemasons due to expense, and seems to have founded the Illuminati so that he could have his own club. So it's like,
right.
You won't let me join your club, so I'll make my own club with blackjack. And he did later join them as an Illuminatus, but to garner ideas and recruits. And according to this novel, he took over the Masons and continues to use them as a front for the Illuminati to this day. and something similar happened to the Rosicrucians. And yeah, in actual history, the Illuminati was disbanded by 1785 by royal edict, um, and they were driven underground, where they, well, I mean, according to conspiracy theories that are very popular, they were driven underground and became the secret puppet masters responsible for everything, including the French Revolution and so forth. And according to this book, and this was apparently conspiracy theory at the time, like they didn't make this up, but it's obviously crap. But Weishaupt murdered George Washington and took his place and became the president after that, because supposedly they looked alike. So even then, I don't know if that's possible.
That's, I think, a theory that existed but was popularized by this book more than anything. I don't know if that was a very common conspiracy theory. It was out, as we say, these were all pre-existing conspiracy theories. But I think that's one of the big ones that this book popularized, because I don't see any trace of that before that. But certainly,
yeah, but it does seem to be still believed in some circles. I've seen YouTube videos that claim,
Well, people can't get away from the fact that there's a giant eye in a pyramid on the American dollar bill.
Yeah, which wasn't actually an Illuminati symbol. That was... We just take it as that because it's a weird thing to put on there.
Right. Well, that's just it. The creation of it's probably a Masonic symbol.
Yeah.
The thing about the Freemasons is that they're a pretty secretive group, and this is true of the original Illuminati, the historical Illuminati as well, and all these other groups. Once the Enlightenment hit, you had a group of people going, well, we're powerful and important people, and we need to form a group that will, sustain human society because we're so important and we're so smart. And let's also do it.
And also get drunk and play ping pong.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that is exactly it. What they were making fun of with that Simpsons episode.
Yeah, exactly.
And I mean, even it goes down to like things like Elks Club and Kiwanis Club, which are not, and Rotarians, which are, not at all mystical, as far as I know.
And the Shriners.
The Shriners, they have a bit of mysticism, I think, and a bit of sort of, and then it goes all the way up to things like Yale Skull and Bones Club, which is famously is a secret club for again, and I mean, part of it is just it's a group of very rich, powerful, wealthy, important people, and they're all they're brought into a club. They're made to feel like, oh, you're special because you've gone through the initiation rites and you've passed through the special levels of initiation.
But it's basically just frat hazing.
Right, yeah, I mean, in many cases, they're very old organizations, and they have a lot of tradition, and they also dressed it up in mysticism, and that's one of the interesting things, because they all tend to be post-Enlightenment groups, and they often talk about how, enlightened they are, and how they're fighting for rationality in society, but then they have all this, like, secret mysticism going on. But that's, of course, what makes them the focus of conspiracy, because they have so much secretive ritual and stuff like that. In this book, a common refrain from the Illuminati, whenever they've accomplished something, destroyed one of their enemies, is Jacques de Molay, you are avenged, because he was one of the Knights Templar. He was apparently the head of the Knights Templar, and supposedly he wanted to bring in more rationalism and take them away from superstition, and he was killed by the king. And so the
square and compass was his idea, apparently.
Right. Yes, the square and compass.
The Freemasons adopted.
Right. So he's seen as sort of one of the early martyrs to reason and against superstition and the monarchy and all those kinds of ideas. And that's what supposedly Weishaupt was trying to do with the Illuminati, was introduce the principles of reason and have more of a humanist aspect of life. And then that's why they get blamed for things like the French Revolution, because it overthrew the king and was supposedly based on the principles of pure reason. Got rid of, changed the calendar, did all this stuff to make it more rational, right? Mm-hmm. So that's the kind of thing that makes people see them as puppet masters. But it is interesting that, they were anti-monarchical, and yet they're seen as, the really oppressive super leaders of everything, right?
Yeah.
So they're opposed in the novel by the Irisians, or the Discordians, who is another group. You want to talk about
Um,
them?
yeah, sure. Discordianism was sort of founded in the 60s. Um,
63 was when they published the Principia Discordia.
yeah, it was written by Malaclips the Younger,
Mm-hmm.
who was later found out to be an author named Gregory Hill,
Mm-hmm.
who died in 2000. Um, he was one of two writers, along with Carrie Wendell Thornley,
Mm-hmm.
aka Lord Omar Caham
Omar
Ravenhurst.
Khayyam Ravenhurst. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Um, uh, and apparently they came, or Malaclips the Younger is named after Malaclips the Elder,
Mm-hmm.
um, who in the Principia Discordia describes him as a non-prophet, and he was mistaken for a doomsayer when he was seen carrying a sign that read "dumb."
Yeah.
But in the Illuminatus trilogy, that Malaclips the Elder is a character in the book. He's a shape-shifting immortal who's from the 4th century BC. He was an Arisian priest who achieved transcendental illumination due to the massacre at Melos in 1415 BC.
Right. Yeah. The idea that we're presented with at one point is that mass there you can be translated into an energy matrix, i.e., an immortal being. If there's, they say there's a number of ways, but the one they keep focusing on is mass slaughter of humanity, which is why the Illuminati. That's what the Illuminati wants to accomplish. They want to perform mass human sacrifice so that they'll all transcend our plane and go to a new reality, essentially.
And according to this book, the Holocaust was an attempt at that.
Right. Yeah, and in the book they're building towards, yeah, we literally want to end the world, kill everyone, but the Illuminatus will ascend into energy lattices and go on. So that's
Mm-hmm.
kind of the ticking clock that they're fighting in the book.
Yeah. But Malaclips the Elder in the Illuminatus trilogy was also posed as Jesus after Jesus was crucified.
Mm-hmm.
So in this book, the resurrected Jesus was just this imposter. And it says that and in this form he introduced bingo, but asked Luke not to record it.
Right. And it was to show that everything is a game, basically. That
Yeah.
was part of the message they were trying to pass on. But the Arisians are a group who again, as is more or less outlined in the book, and the book is very heavily Arisian. There's actually a lot of discussion over whether Robert Anton Wilson might have been involved in the writing of the Principia Discordia in the first place.
Yeah,
Uh,
he was often given as the before they found out who it actually was. He was given as the true identity as Malaclips the Younger, but
mm-hmm.
so was Richard Nixon. So you know.
Yeah, there's a lot of. Well, I mean, it's not hard to see why people would associate him with the Principia Discordia, because he basically, this is almost a supplemental text to the Principia Discordia.
Yeah,
Principia
and it's
Discordia,
very important in modern Discordianism, which is still around.
right? Yeah, well, he
The
was a
Illuminatus
Discordian.
trilogy. Yeah.
Yeah, no, yeah, he was full on. Wilson was a Discordian, and the Principia Discordia is very, it's very much an outgrowth of the beatnik type writing of the 50s. It's very stream of consciousness. It's a series of actually kind of witty jokes and puns and things in many ways. That's meant to sort of strike a blow against everything rational and moral and everything that we rely on. But it doesn't make a lot of sense. It's a manifesto slash religious document. Whereas the Illuminatus trilogy is almost an attempt to explain it to a certain extent. They kind of talk about the theories and the principles that are underlying it in the book. Hagbard Chelene basically lays everything out as George Dorn gets illuminated. He explains the principles that went into it. It's to expand your reality tunnel. It's the idea that everyone experiences reality through a tunnel that filters out all the stuff they don't like or they don't want to accept. And it's trying to sort of blow your mind in that 60s hippie way. So
Yeah,
that
there's an important aspect of it, which we're gonna have to bleep this, but it's Operation Mind,
right.
or OM, which we'll refer to it as, and it's it's a thing that's intentionally trying to challenge people's perceptions. So it's sort of like I don't know, intellectual terrorism in a way, I guess. Like
Uh,
trying to like attack people's sense of understanding of reality.
right.
Um, so like they'll let's see. There's a few things here. Our project Graffito. Anybody can participate by inventing a particularly Arisian slogan and seeing that it's given wide distribution.
Hmm.
Examples: Your local police are armed and dangerous. Legalize free enterprise murder. Why should governments have all the fun?
Yeah,
Smash the government postal monopoly. If voting could change the system, it would be against the law, etc.
yeah,
There's also sending people pope cards, so that
right,
claiming every man, woman, and child on earth is a pope of discord.
right. I've seen one that's literally a poster that says, "If you can read this, you are a pope." Yeah, and it's essentially, yeah, just trying to make everything. It's sort of in many ways it's a predecessor of internet culture, I think, and posting basically. Again, I'll have to believe that, but yeah, just completely random memes and images that are supposed to mess everything up.
Yeah, and this is sort of taken like. Did you read about the meme magic from online Nazis during the 2016 election?
Yeah, yeah, that's right.
Yeah, supposedly
Um,
they were using memes, usually Pepe the Frog memes, but actually imbuing them with magical energy and sending them out to disrupt how people think.
yeah,
And
well,
it's sort of
yeah,
like
and
the Grant
that's
Morrison idea of the hyper sigil. So
right,
it's like
right,
it's a sigil, a magical sigil, but it has to be seen by enough people in order. So it's yeah,
right.
whatever.
Yeah, well, we should discuss. That's, I think, something we'll discuss a little later.
Yeah,
So, but yes, you're right. There's definitely, you can see a lot of things that are tied into to modern internet culture and just information culture in general. It was pursued in the book by people giving out. Well, first of all, there's the ELF, which is the Special Radical Group of the Discordians, the
the
Arisian
Eurasian Liberation Front.
Right. And they go around dosing people with a drug that contains acid and a number of other things called AUM, which it's supposed to turn neophobes into neophiles and make people start exploring new ideas and become, radically receptive. And a number of points in the book, you learn, some figure of authority or someone significant has been changed by AUM and is starting to pursue all these crazy things, like a judge who becomes very interested in mathematics in the middle of a trial and basically lets all the defendants go because he finds the government is not legitimate. There's a crazy crackpot Alex Jones type radio host, or rather a phone. I didn't quite get this. He leaves messages on a phone line for people to call in that get crazier and crazier because of that, but they're based on radical liberation of sexual freedoms, and a few other people. And there's a police officer who kind of goes down that road and becomes a quintuple agent for all the different groups.
Oh yeah, that character was fun. There's some narration from him. He's joined the Illuminati, the Discordians. He's working for the mafia, the FBI, the CIA. You know, all these.
Yeah, the syndicate.
Uh, yeah, the
We should men-
syndicate.
we should mention the syndicate, by the way. There is a world crime syndicate which they have to deal with in the first book. Basically, they get them to switch from the Illuminati to the Arisians, and then the heads of
Oh,
it
and
are
it's led by a guy named Robert Putney Drake, who's sort of a major character in this.
right,
Or at least we get a lot of his backstory and stuff. He's a
right,
mob boss, but he's obsessed with the occult because he just wants to hurt the world,
right.
basically.
Right. Well, he interpreted what it was he'd read the last words of Dutch Schultz, who was, and this is another real thing. He was as you've probably heard of him. He was a gangster in the 30s. After he was shot, he went on he spent all night, saying very strange things to police, and it was because he was shot and he was rambling in non-lucid ways, but very, very strange, almost beat poetry. And so the book has it that this was a secret code because he'd been inducted into the Illuminati, and by cracking it, Drake was basically able to uh, get himself in charge of all the various crime syndicates that were connected to the Illuminati and
Hmm.
become the head of the World Crime Syndicate with a guy called Don Federico Maldonado, aka Banana Nose.
Who
Um,
doesn't actually have a very large nose, apparently.
yeah, it was again a
But
bit of
Dutch
absurdity.
Schultz, like you said, was a real person, and this actually happened.
Hmm.
And it's actually been very popular with beat poets like William S. Burroughs, who actually wrote a novel in the form of a screenplay called The Last Words of Dutch Schultz.
Right. Yeah. So it is it is crazy and that was in the 30s when he was killed, or even 20s. I'm not sure. So it's interesting that ended up influencing beat poetry, which then in
Hmm.
turn influenced this book, which they're acknowledging by making it a big part of the book, which is kind of interesting. But anyway, as you were talking about the Illuminati being run by a
Oh
rock
yeah,
band.
four of the five Illuminati, because the rule of fives, the Illuminati also go by magical rules.
Hmm.
Um, four of them are brothers and sisters who formed a rock band called the American Medical Association, the biggest rock band in the world, and they had a festival in Ingolstadt, a
Hmm.
rock festival that would be bigger than Woodstock, and um, a lot of the latter half of the trilogy takes place at that
Right.
or
And
before
it's
it.
going to resurrect a Nazi army that was secretly hidden by Hitler at the bottom
Yeah,
of
at the
Lake.
bottom of the lake, Totenkampf.
Yeah.
Was it Totenkampf?
Totenkopf is the lake, yeah.
Okay, yeah, that means that's the skull and crossbones symbol of the Nazis. Anyway,
Right.
but yeah, so it's zombie Nazis who are at the bottom of a lake,
Hmm.
and the idea is they would come up and kill all the people there, and this would be a mass sacrifice that would
Right.
allow both the Illuminati Prime, to ascend to the higher plane, but also various people who were, you know,
Right.
part of their group, which included an elderly Hitler who had apparently survived.
Right. And then the Nazi army was going to march into Russia, and that was going to help trigger World War III, which was, and there was it's actually not a huge part of the book, but there's a an island called Fernando Poo off the coast of Africa, which has become the source of international tensions for ridiculous reasons, basically just because of a huge misunderstanding. And then at
Hmm.
the same time, there's a
Oh, Fernando Poo is also the last outcropping of Atlantis.
right. It's all tied together, yes. And there's also a bacteriological agent called anthrax leprosy pie, which has gotten loose from a base in Las Vegas. So all these things are supposed to come together and basically cause the end of the world, because everyone's going to die, but the Illuminati will then ascend, as we said, via translation. But yes, the big rock band is going to the big rock concert in Ingolstadt is going to trigger everything.
Hmm.
And there is one other thing I think we should
Oh,
mention. H.P. Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, H.P. Lovecraft is a character in this book.
Right,
He's visited by Robert Putney Drake in a flashback, and because Lovecraft has written about a number of things that are apparently real,
right.
like Cthulhu and the Necronomicon and all these things that are
The
supposedly real
Yeah.
in the fiction of this book. And but Lovecraft himself didn't believe in any of it, as he didn't in real life.
Hmm.
So Drake was actually disappointed by this. So so the Necronomicon is real, as are Cthulhu and all these other
Right.
creatures, who in this book are called Lyogor,
Loloigor. Yeah, that.
Loigor, sorry,
Yeah.
which is comes from an August Darlith story from 1932, set in the Cthulhu mythos.
Oh, okay.
Darlith was, of course, uh, the most influential post-Lovecraft writer,
Right.
for better or worse.
Yeah, he
He
was
actually
actually.
coined the phrase Cthulhu mythos,
Yeah.
and
He
he
well
sort of
he was
he
the editor.
organized
He
it
edited.
into a coherent thing, but he sort of diluted it in the process.
Right, that's right. There's been some controversy because in many ways there wasn't really a Cthulhu mythos
Yeah,
until Darlith put it all together. And
yeah,
here
and
we,
named it that, and but he also did keep the thing alive for a long time, so
right, yeah.
we might
Well,
not
as
know about it today if it weren't for him. So Loigor was the name of one specific old one, the great old ones, like Cthulhu and so forth. who was an air elemental, because Darlet split all the old ones into like elemental categories. It was kind of stupid. But
Okay.
later, the word Loigor was used by Colin Wilson in The Return of the Loigor from
Okay.
1969, and I had read this one before I read the Illuminatus trilogy, so I was sort of already familiar with the word. Um,
Okay.
Here, they're invisible vortexes of psychic energy, um, who sort of they can manifest and destroy things, but they have to sort of suck out life force from people.
Okay.
So they caused the Grand Canyon through a massive explosion, and they sunk Mu and all these other things.
Right.
So this is the first book that uses Lo Igor as a um, stand-in for the phrase "Great Old One." So all
Hmm.
like Cthulhu in this book in Illuminatus trilogy is Lo Igor, as
Right.
is Yog Sothoth. Sothoth. I always have trouble saying that one. But
Yeah. I
and
say
this
Yog
was
Sothoth, but I don't know if that's the
okay.
correct
Yog
pronunciation.
Sothoth. That's easier. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, Other writers have since adopted this, including Alan Moore and Grant Morrison.
Hmm.
And apparently, the word might come from Loeger, which is the medieval Welsh name for England.
Huh. Okay. Interesting.
Yeah. So Yog Sothoth was a cosmic entity created by H.P. Lovecraft. According to letters, he was the grandfather of sorts. It's kind of complicated of Cthulhu. So he's sort of his spawn sort of reproduced into Cthulhu through parthenogenesis.
Right. Right.
Anyway, um, in this book, he's the eater of souls as he feeds off the psychic vibration of energy produced by dying victims.
Hmm.
Um, and so mass sacrifice feeds him basically. And he
Right.
was imprisoned beneath the Pentagon by the Illuminati.
Yeah.
And at the end of the story, during the Ingolstadt thing, he's freed and sort of
Right.
he's the
Yeah.
catalyst for some of the.
An earthquake brings down the Pentagon, and they said they saw who was it? The Secretary of Defense. Someone came running up to the Pentagon to try and draw a line to to complete that the wall of the Pentagon so that he wouldn't be let loose, but he failed.
I'd forgotten about that. There's so much stuff in this book.
Yeah, well, it was. He talks about how the ancient Atlanteans first drew down and imprisoned Yok Sotot, as they call him in the old version, in a giant pentagon of black stone, which was then destroyed when Atlantis was destroyed. So it took them a while to bring him, and he's kind of the spirit of chaos. He's not. He's sort of amoral, unlike Lovecraft, where he'd be a horrific thing. I mean, he's not
unknowable. He does have a personality, and he does talk in this book.
right. So he like I say, he kind of represents the destruction of worldly authority and the unleashing of chaos, which is neither good nor bad inherently. It's hard to associate him automatically with good because he's this big evil organism, but that's kind of what the book is building towards. So he's also kind of a good thing. He's also associated with Bugs Bunny, which is kind of hilarious. You noticed that, right?
Yeah. He's as an agent of chaos.
Right, because he talks about how Weishaupt saw in some of the pictures in the Necronomicon that the creatures looked like the Shoggoths looked like a cartoon rabbit, basically.
Yeah.
So
and it also mentions them in the Atlantis flashback part. So
right,
Bugs Bunny. So
yeah,
but
there's bunnies are a motif throughout the book, but it's evoking Bugs Bunny as the spirit of chaos and
yeah, it works.
Irreverence to authority. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I think we've outlined most of the stuff here.
We didn't talk about the John Dillingers.
Well, oh yeah, okay. Well, there's there's the assassination of JFK and John Dillinger. So yeah, go ahead.
So there's John Dillinger was of course a bank robber in real life. In this, he's actually quintuplets, all named John Dillinger with different middle names.
Okay.
You don't remember this?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, sorry.
Okay, yeah, sorry. And one of them shot JFK, and so they're sort of the leader of the Jams, which is the Justified Agents of Mumu, which are left-wing communist, sort of like the Arisian Front, but more explicitly anti-capitalist.
Yeah, they tie into they're sort of the ancient answer to the original Illuminati and their Atlantean heritage, basically.
So yeah, they and one of them ends up killing some of the Illuminati Primus, the American Medical Association, end up getting killed off one by one, and one of the John Dillingers was responsible for that.
Right.
For one of them, anyway.
Yeah. Early on, George Dorn meets John Dillinger, who's apparently survived his assassination by the feds, but it's he's
it's not revealed to the end that there were 5 of them.
Right, exactly.
So his mysterious escape from the prison is because it was just another one of them.
Right.
There's a lot of stuff in this book.
Yes.
It's hard to keep track of everything. Right. I remember when I read it the first time, and I was like, I couldn't tell the difference between George Dorn and Joe Malick and Simon Moon, and like they were all mixed up in my head because they're sort of similar characters. They fulfill different plot roles, but they're all
right.
So rereading it again for this was very helpful on that front. Like I figured it out by the end, but like knowing who they are from the beginning helps.
Well, the book is actually written on these different, quote, time tracks. So you're sort of you're following Joe Malick as he was originally inducted a few years earlier, just as you're following George Dorn as he's being inducted in what is, quote, the present, unquote. So that those two can kind of blend together sometimes. They're both up for confrontation. They're both reporters, all that kind of stuff. But yeah, it's so it uses again deliberately confusing storytelling technique.
It rewards rereadings, I think.
Absolutely, yeah. So I think we've laid out most of the important stuff of the mythos.
Oh, Fish and Chips.
Yeah.
I like that character. He's not really important, but I liked he's James Bond parody.
Yeah, he's quadruple
05.
So he's and they literally say that he read too much James Bond and became James Bond himself.
And I like his name, Fish and Chips.
Fish and Chips, yeah.
And
he's
because he was born on the day of the Hiroshima or something like that. I can't remember.
Yeah, and he's investigating Fernando Poo. He believes it's. He has a secret. He, of course, has his Spectre-like secret society called Bugger, which he believes is behind everything. One of the recurring sort of motifs in this book is that when you've got a bunch of people, you've got an authority figure who is investigating for the authorities, they either go nowhere or they get basically flipped over into the Arisians.
Yeah.
Like Saul Goodman.
And lastly, in terms of major characters, there's a lot, but there's also the Dalai Lama.
Right.
Who is a holy man who lives below the Dealey Plaza, which is where JFK was shot.
Right.
And
and he's based on the principle of basically doing nothing. Whereas the other the ALF and people want to go out and
should we give away the twist?
You know what? Let's do that in the next one, because I think let's wrap up this show right now. We're going to continue into part 2. This is going to be a 2-part episode. In the next episode, we'll talk more about Hagbard Celine, and we'll reveal the secret of the Illuminati.
So for now, we've been Philip Rice and Adam Prosser, Illuminati Primi of the Order of the Unbroken Circle. Definitely not the ones who stole your socks. The theme song was by Jack Feerick, who will be touring Ingolstadt in the spring, and special thanks to Alex Ross, who can hear us via the radio transmissions in your Billings. This show will be continued next week from an undisclosed location. You'll get the instructions on how to tune in a seemingly unused drop box on the corner of St. Elm in Maine. The password is Swordfish. Do not wear purple.